All right, so now that we've got our primary cables out of the way and they're behind us, it's time to move on to our vertical cables. And at the end of the vertical cables, that's pretty much going to wrap up all of the geometry, and all that's going to be left is getting this guy packaged up into a digital asset.
Yeah, exactly.
So Steve, how did Peter go about getting those vertical cables in place?
Well, we've already got our main cables in place. So he utilized the lines that we'd set up, all our points and their positions of those points, so that we could set up some tubes that basically join our main deck up to the cables.
That sounds nice.
And so the basic way that he went about doing this was to take the current position in Y of each of the points and add that as a new variable onto the curve, onto the line, as a sort of a height variable, and then set the position of all the points in Y down to 0 so that it just runs along here. Because then we can copy some tubes to those points, and using stamping we can use that height variable that's on a point-by-point basis to actually set the height of the tube so that it will all come up and meet this cable.
Okay.
So with that, let's up here, after we've switched between the 3 cables, but before we set our normals, let's make ourselves some room.
Go ahead and maximize it. It'll be a little bit easier.
There we go. I'm going to branch off of this guy with a resample node, because we're going to be able to choose how many secondary cables we want, and we're going to use this node to do so. So if I bring and turn on points for a second, uncheck that, check maximum segments. So we're going to use this to basically scale up and down the number of points so that we can control how many secondary cables we have.
Okay.
Which really makes sense for us to have an integer parameter over in our master control. So let's edit the parameter interface, drop out an integer, and we can call this guy num secondary cables. And that's really bad spelling. And we can set our range so that it's locked at 0, so we might choose to have no cables. And I'm going to set the range up to 20, but leave it unlocked, so we can accept that. So down here on the resample, let's grab our number of secondary cables and copy that. On the resample, we want to have one segment when we have no secondary cables. We're not going to copy to this first and the end point, so we're going to use a similar expression that we've seen before, which takes basically the number of cables we're going to have and add 1 to that, so that we're dealing with number of divisions. So we have 2 divisions, 1 division when we have no cables, which is going to give us just the endpoints. When we have 1 cable, we have 2 divisions, giving us that middle point, and so on.
Okay.
So we can wire this resample into a group node so that we can group all the points except for these, the first and the last. So let's wire this into a group node. And let's call this group center points. And we'll set the node name to the same as the group name to follow our convention. We're dealing with points. And I'm going to group by range here. And the range I'm going to group to is going to grab 1 of 1, so that we're grabbing everybody. But I'm going to start at 1 and go to $n-1, so we've seen that before, to grab all of the center points. I'm going to wire this group node into a attribute create node to allow us to take our current position in Y and add that as a new attribute called pillar height. So the attribute name is going to be pillar height, and we can specify a local variable, which is basically any nodes that follow on from this guy can access that local variable. So we can give it a simpler name, a simpler way to reference that. And that variable name we're going to give is ph, both capitals, and we'll use that down on the copy node we're about to feed this into to get back to this value.
Okay.
We want to set our value to the current translate y, the current position of the point in translate y. So we'll set value 1 to $ty. Well, now that we've got the pillar height actually added to these points, we can go ahead and set these points down to 0 so that we can copy tubes to them. So let's wire this into a new point node. And let's set the position in Y to 0, which will bring all the points down to 0. So now we can go ahead and create a tube node, tube node, so that we can use this tube to copy onto all these points. So let's drop down a tube node. I'll rename this to secondary cable base. And let's set our center in Y so that, let's bring our visibility down to this guy. We're going to set the center in Y so it's always sitting on the origin, since we know that that's where the base of all our cables needs to come down to. And we can do that by referencing our height channel and dividing that by 2, because currently we're half and half over the origin, and that will bring us up to the origin there. So let's set up a couple of controls on our master control to control both the radius and if we set this guy over to polygon, we can control the detail as well. So let's bring in a new float to control radius. So there's our end arc, middle arc, number of secondary cables. So this will be secondary cable radius. And we'll give that a range of 0.001 through to 1. And then let's drop in an integer value, which we will call sec cable detail. And I'll give that a range again from 3 through to 10.
Okay.
If we accept that, was that a float? Possibly was. No, I'm seeing things. That's all good. Best double check. I swore that that was a float that I just put in place, and it blew my mind. So let's grab our secondary cable detail, and over on the detail, we only need 2 rows, but let's change our columns over to the detail that we have here, so we can now control the detail on the tubes. And let's grab our secondary cable radius, and use that to control the radius over here on the tube tab. So paste and paste. So now we can control the radius of the tube using this.
Okay.
So we can now copy this to every single point except for the endpoints, and we can use the attribute we just set up on the line and stamp it back to set up the height of the tube. So let's wire this guy into a new copy SOP. And I'm going to rename this copy to sec cable copy. And we can wire our point node into the template geometry. Currently we're copying to every point. Currently also we have crazy high radius. It's better. So we're going to use the template group of group center points to take out the 2 endpoints. And let's stamp on this attribute we just set up a minute ago. So I'm going to actually give this a stamp name of pillar height. Let me just double check that I put a T on the end. And we can use our $PH. Notice that it changed color. It actually recognized that since we set it up here and it's available to us. So we're going to stamp for each copy. It's going to get the pillar height of the point that it's just been copied to stamped onto it. So that now means that that's available to us back up on here since it's being stamped. So we can set our height to stamp. Sec cable copy is the name of the copy node. We called it pillar height, and let's have that return 1 if it fails, but we can see there that indeed looks as if it's following with the cable.
Fantastic.
So before we skin...
Before we're going to merge them all together now.
Yeah. So after we've skinned the cables. So before we skin it, we're going to be skinning some stuff that doesn't need skinning. I was getting a little confused. So after we skin the cables, but before we copy them down the length,
right,
we can wire in a merge. And we can take this guy and wire that into the merge. And that will give us our secondary cables there. As that goes up into the towers and gets duplicated around, if we come to our final merge,
look at that.
It's coming a little heavy.
Let's go ahead and turn off our points again.
Yeah, they become really useful when we're dealing with curves. And as soon as you get everything else, it's just like blue. So let's find our master control and start changing some of these guys up. So I think one of the most important things to do is see, are these guys going to be following our cables? So let's start changing up the arcs on our cables.
Oh, you gotta love
it.
Recap those.
Yeah, they're going to be on these guys. So Let's just in case cable height isn't taken as well. Let's see if that works without actually switching over to look at the expressions. There we go. So you see that's affecting the cables, and nice. Cables are following along nicely with those. The number of secondary cables we can drop right down. We can boost the radius up or down.
Fantastic. Go ahead and make the radius real thin.
Zoom in and grab. Something like that.
Yeah, that's better.
And then if we change we got our detail, if we want to change the detail. But let's change our cable height. Let's grab that and drop that down. You see that cables are following along as well. So, yeah, Peter came up with a very nice solution for the secondary cables.
Yes, he did.
It's very impressive.
A very good job. And that's really going to wrap up the network.
Yeah, pretty much. Everything else now is just getting this guy into a digital asset and cleaning things up. For the network itself, this is it.
All right. Well, that's going to wrap up this video. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.